Right. Well, good afternoon from Singapore. Thank you for attending our seminar on the new Gencon 2022. My name is Julien and I will be joined by my colleagues from the Singapore office, Eugene, Manali, and Ganesh. The Gencon charter party is the most widely used voyage charter party in the bulk cargo trade. And it's actually more than 100 years old. The first version dates back to 1922. There are other versions, 1976 and 1994, that all contain small amendments and reflected change in the case law and just clarify the charter party. However, the shipping industry has changed a lot since, and it has become more complex and more regulated. Owners and cargo interests are now subject to regulations that they never really envisaged back in 1994. And as a result, the Gencon 2022 is a major and comprehensive rewriting of the charter party and actually brings it into the 21st century. Now, we'll start with the next slide. We'll start with the first clause, which is the approach voyage. Now, the traditional rule is that the owner has to commence the approach voyage without delay, and it's a strict obligation. This is a rule held in Monroe and Ryan. So Gencon seeks to qualify this strict obligation. And essentially, it says that the owner has to commence the approach voyage without delay unless prevented or hindered by events beyond the owner's control. And actually, this is to cover external causes of delay, such as tide strikes and channel blockages, for example. And it avoids the harshness of the rule in Monroe and Ryan. Next slide. Now, as an illustration of the harshness of that rule is the Pacific Voyager. It's a relatively recent case by shipping standards, 2018. And in this case, the voyage was carrying cargo under a previous charter. On her way to discharge this particular cargo, the vessel hit a submerged object. And there's no indication that it was the owner's fault. However, the vessel was out of order for several months and was unable to proceed to the delivery place under the new fixture. Chargers claimed damages, and the court held that owners were under strict obligation to commence the approach voyage and therefore were liable, even though it wasn't their fault. Now, I just want to clarify that this is just a commencement. Had this accident occurred during the approach voyage, the owners may have had a defense, but here we're only talking about clause 1 is only the commencement of the approach voyage. And here, which is a strict obligation, and here, Gencon 2022 kind of qualifies this obligation. Now, my colleague Eugene will now talk to you about clause 2. Next slide.
Good day to everyone tuning in. My name is Eugene, and I will be presenting on clause 2, the owner's responsibilities, clause 3 on cargo, as well as clause 4, which is on loading and discharging operations. Now, the common theme in these new clauses is that the Gencon 2022 seeks to mirror the obligations in the NYPE time charter, such that the position in the Gencon 2022 is back-to-back with the time charters up the chain. Starting with clause 2, this has been significantly amended. Previously, under the Gencon 1994, owners had wide-ranging exclusions of liability, and owners were only liable if there was a lack of due diligence on the part of the individuals who controlled the management of the vessel. The cases have shown that this is a very high threshold. For example, if the owner's operating office is situated in London, a claimant would need to prove that there was a lack of due diligence and not just negligence on the part of the top management of the company before they can hold the owners responsible. To militate this high threshold, it was common to have a clause paramount to incorporate the Hague-Visby rules into the Gencon, but this may be met with resistance from counterparties in the contract. Next slide. Now, under the Gencon 2022, the wide-ranging exclusions of liability have been totally removed. Although there is no clause paramount or Hague-Visby rules incorporated, the new responsibility regime under the Gencon 2022 is somewhat similar to that of the Hague-Visby rules. It states that the owners are to exercise due diligence to provide a vessel which is cargo-worthy at the commencement of loading and seaworthy at the beginning of the loaded voyage. Now, this is slightly narrower than the obligation in the 8 FISB rules, which requires the owners to exercise due diligence before and at the beginning of the voyage to make the ship seaworthy. More importantly, the Gencon 2022 also has a clause 2b, which states that the owners shall be entitled to rely on all rights, defenses, immunities, time bars, and limitations of liability available to a carrier under the Hague FISB rules. This essentially means that even without the incorporation of the Hague FISB rules, the owners can rely on the defenses under Article 4.2 of the Hague FISB rules. Claims by charterers against the owners would also be subject to the 1-year time bar. The cases on the 1-year time bar under the Hague FISB rules held that this only applied to cargo-related claims, but Clause 2b specifically states that the time bar is applicable to any claim that is made against the owners whatsoever. So this is likely to cover all claims made by the charterers against the owners. Next slide. Now, moving on to Clause 3, this is an entirely new clause in the Gencon 2022. The genesis of this clause was due to the fact that shipping operations became more complex, with more regulations being imposed on owners. This new clause allocates to the charterers the responsibility of complying with a wide variety of regulations and requirements for cargo operations. Next slide. The new requirements which are pushed to the charterers include documentation and storage of the cargo, treatment, handling, and disposal of stowage and securing materials, requirements for the cargo to be lawful at all material times, requirements for the cargo to be properly fit and suitable for the intended voyage, and an obligation for the charterers to provide all information for advanced cargo declarations. Next slide. Now, specifically, Clause 3 also deals with common issues faced in cargo operations like bulk cargo, hard cargo, cargo harmful to the environment, as well as lighterage operations. We'll now look at a few examples of how this new cargo clause works on certain operations. Next slide. For example, Clause 3 makes it clear that the charterers are responsible for any resulting claim for commingling, and if the cargo is not segregated according to its grades. It also makes it clear that the charterers are responsible for short delivery and overlanding of cargo in situations when the cargo is delivered to more than one receiver, or if the cargo is discharged at more than one berth. For lighterage operations, if the cargo needs to be lighted into barges, the cost and responsibility of the lighterage operations will be placed on the charterers. So you can see the flavor of this new Clause 3 is that it essentially places all risks, responsibilities, costs, and intricacies of such cargo operations on the charterers. Next slide. Moving next to Clause 4 of the Gencon, which deals with loading and discharging operations. This mirrors the position in the NYPE 2015 time charter, where the charterers are responsible for the entirety of cargo operations, including loading, stowage, trimming, securing, etc. One important point to note is that Clause 4 makes it clear that charterers are also responsible for the additional costs of cargo operations if the vessel has to leave and shift from one berth to the other. So if you have bad weather like a hurricane or excessive swell, the costs and delays would be placed on the charterers. Next slide. Now, another important aspect of Clause 4 is the responsibility for stevedore damage. This is found in Clause 4D of the Gencon 2022. Again, this mirrors the position in most NYPE time charters, where the charterers will be responsible for stevedore damage. Over here on the left, you will find a flow chart on the sequence of events concerning a stevedore damage incident. A key thing to note is that under Clause 4D2, there is a mandatory requirement for owners to notify the charterers of the damage as soon as reasonably possible. The notice has to describe the damage and invite the charterers to appoint a surveyor to assess the damage. This clause makes it clear that if the owners do not notify the charterers, or if the contents of the notice are defective, or if the charterers were not given an opportunity to survey the damage, the charterers shall not be responsible for such stevedore damage. Similar to the regime in most time charters, the charterers are responsible to repair damage affecting seaworthiness before the vessel sails from port, and on the other hand, damages restricting the trading capabilities of the vessel are to be repaired before leaving the last port of discharge. Next, I'll be passing this to my colleague Manali, who will start on Clause 5 and cargo fumigation.
Thank you, Eugene. My name is Manali, and I'll be covering the clauses 5, 9, 10, 12, and 14 of the Gencon. Clause 5 is a new clause, and it covers cargo fumigation. It deals with onboard fumigation of the cargo, and it places the responsibility for fumigation on charterers. The clause is actually designed to deal with problems of costs and delays which may arise during such operations. Fumigation is done at charterer's cost, expense, risk, and responsibility. It is the charterer's responsibility also to deal with all regulations relating to the fumigation. Next slide, please. Clause 9 covers the tendering of the notice of readiness, and very simply, it must be done in writing. It can be served anytime, day or night. The NOR can be tendered prior to the commencement of the laycan. However, the laytime shall not begin before the time unless cargo operations start earlier. Now, clause 9 also states the position under English law, which states that several NORs can be tendered without prejudice to the validity of the other NORs. Moreover, clause 9 also states that if the berth is not designated or reachable, the vessel can tender the NOR from any waiting place ordered by a relevant authority or a customary anchorage area, whether she's in free fatigue or not, or whether customs cleared or not. Next slide, please. Clause 9 also deals with the state of holes, which is an entirely new provision which entitles the charterers to cancel if upon arrival alongside the ship holes are found not to be ready and cannot be brought up to the requisite standard by the cancelling date or within the fixed period. Now, whilst this may seem draconian, it recognizes the fundamental nature of a ship owner's obligation to present the ship which is ready to load in all respects. Now, let us take some time to go through the process. The starting position is before tendering a notice of readiness, there is a due diligence obligation to ensure that all holes in which the cargo is to be loaded is clean, dry, and in all respects suitable to receive the cargo. If the holes are ready, cargo operations will commence after the initial inspection. If they're found not to be ready after the initial inspection, the vessel will enter a joint inspection. If the holes pass the joint inspection, cargo operations will commence as per normal. Here to note, time waiting prior to the initial inspection will count. Any time actually lost after the initial inspection until the subsequent joint inspection will not count. If the vessel's holes are found still not to be ready after a joint inspection, she has failed the joint inspection, charterers have the option to cancel the charter. This cancellation option must be exercised by the charterers within 12 hours after the expiry of the grace period of 96 hours or by the cancellation date, whichever comes later, provided the vessel is free of cargo. Now, if the charterers exercise the option to cancel the charterers still have to compensate the owners for all time spent waiting for the berth after tendering the NOR. Next slide, please. Essentially, this slide covers clauses 10 and 12, which talk about laytime. Clause 10 particularly talks about laytime and incorporates the BIMCO laytime definitions for Charter Parties 2013. Under clause 10, subsection B, weather is now seen as an exception rather than an interruption. If you may recall, older versions of the Gencon used the expression weather permitting to make it clear that laytime would run continuously unless the actual working of the vessel was prevented. The new version has replaced this phrase with except to the extent that actual loading, discharging is delayed or prevented by weather. This now would be a good time to also revisit the difference between an interruption versus an exception. With an interruption to laytime, all that needs to be shown for a causation is that the excluded state of affairs existed at that place where the cargo would have been worked. With an exception to laytime, it is necessary to show the causal connection between what is excluded and the failure to work cargo. The new Gencon version supports the latter. Moving on to clause 12, which covers the running of laytime. Subclause A covers the time and costs used for shifting between berths in the same port, and that is for charterer's account. Subclause B covers any delay in loading and discharging that may arise due to environmental or public health concerns relating to the cargo. This time will count as lay time or time on demurrage, and all related expenses will be for charterer's account. Now, moving on to subclause C, which essentially states that lay time or time on demurrage shall run continuously until the completion of cargo operations, which includes the removal of stevedores' equipment from the vessel. Under this clause, charterers are then permitted 3 hours after the completion of the cargo operations to deal with cargo documentation and formalities. After the 3 hours lapse, lay time and demurrage will start as per normal. This is a new addition. This addition serves essentially to simplify the owner's position. Under the older Gencon, there were always disputes surrounding the owner's claim for damages for detention, such as when does detention start and what is the applicable rate for such damages. This clause aims to simplify that. Next slide, please. Clause 14 covers cancelling. Now, Clause 14 enables cancellation if the ship has not tendered a valid NOR before the cancelling date, rather than it being linked to the arrival of the ship. Subsection A of Clause 14 states that if the vessel fails to tender her NOR by cancelling date, charterers have the option of cancelling the charter within 48 hours of the cancellation date. Subsection B states a position where it is clear that the vessel will not be able to tender an NOR by cancelling date, i.e. that the vessel is running late, the owners to notify the charterers without delay, stating what the vessel's new ETA is going to be and asking whether the charterers are agreeable to this new ETA or whether they wish to exercise the option for cancelling the CP. Such an option has to be declared within 48 hours of receiving the notice from the owners. This option in subsection B is available to the owners only once. This clause is more flexible than the Gencon 1994, since it gives the charterers the option to accept the owner's new ETA or alternatively to cancel the charter party, whereas under the older version, the new cancelling date was deemed to be the 7th day after the new readiness date given by the owner. Now I'll hand over the time to Ganesh, who will take you through the other clauses under the Gencon 2022.
Thanks, Manali, for taking us through the NOR and laytime provisions and the cancelling clause. And thanks again to everyone for calling in. I'm Ganesh, and I'll be taking you through the suspension and termination clause, the new strikes clause, the general exceptions clause, and clause 26, the helpful agency clause. Now, turning to the suspension clause and the suspension termination clause, this is a new clause, perhaps the biggest development in the Gencon 2022, and I might suggest the climax to this presentation. Now, similar to the NYPE suspension clauses, this clause applies to agreed sums due under the voyage charter party. It's clause 16A makes it clear that the non-payment of freight, dead freight, and demurrage is what triggers the application of this clause. The clause also covers other compensation in accordance with the requirement of this charter party. Now, while we know that dead freight is a form of damages, it's a form of liquidated damages. It's very likely that just like in the NYPE, that this suspension clause does not extend to a claim for unliquidated damages. It's only agreed sums that are payable under this charter party. So now, again, similar to the NYPE suspension clause, suspension by the owner can be exercised immediately without giving notice to charterers. It's just the moment sums that are due remain unpaid, this suspension can be exercised immediately. Then again, personally, we have a preference for we recommend that notice is given. This makes it clear for both parties what's going on, and doesn't leave charterers wondering why owners are suddenly not performing their charter party obligations. Now, the other side of this coin of immediacy, is that the right to suspend needs to be exercised very soon after the sums fall due and are unpaid. Now, so far, the law on suspension clauses has developed entirely in the context of time charter parties, and that's materially different from a voyage charter party. You have regular payments at predictable intervals, and in a voyage charter party, you've got stages of performance. So that's in a voyage charter party, you have a few large lump sum payments usually. So you don't have the situation where the next tranche of hire would overtake a previous deduction, a previous shortfall, or previous non-payment of hire. So it's not clear how the requirement that suspension needs to be exercised as soon as possible after sums have not been have fallen overdue will be interpreted by the courts. We're not clear yet exactly how, in what situation an operator on a voyage charter party is going to be said to have waived their right to terminate. That's also a false urgency, you might say. If a vessel is at open sea on a carriage voyage, that portion of a voyage they're doing without charterers' cooperation or involvement, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to expect owners to suspend performance while at sea. But I'm gonna take the easy way out and say that we're going to have to wait for courts to decide on how the waiver, the law on waiver of the right to suspend, that we are fairly familiar with in the time charter context, is going to be imported in the voyage charter party context. Now, turning to the termination provision at clause 16, this is set out at clause 16b of the Gencon 2022. It's generally similar to the NYPE termination clauses, but it is dissimilar in a very important respect. Now, clause 16b requires owners to give 96 hours, 96 running hours, essentially, or about 4 days of notice to charterers if the dead freight demurrage or other compensation has not been paid. If you compare that with the NYPE 93, that's open-ended, but it reckons time in banking days. And the NYPE 2015 also, the unamended version of it requires notice of 3 banking days. So because of when notice is given, the 3 banking days could in fact run longer than 96 hours. But it depends, entirely on when disponent owners, or in any case, might pull the plug and issue their notice. So instead of rolling the dice on this issue, it might be a better idea to amend clause 16b so that their window of 96 hours is amended to something shorter than the 3 banking days, so that that these operators on a voyage charter party never find themselves in a position where disponent owners have withdrawn the vessel, but they remain liable under the voyage charter party to still perform the voyage charter party. Otherwise, what we also know about these anti-technicality notices, so these notices to pay, is that it needs to be unequivocal. It needs to say that owners will terminate the charter party, not merely that they may terminate, or that they reserve the right to terminate. And the last subsection of clause 16 is clause 16c, and that's it includes an indemnity for the benefit of owners from charterers for any liabilities owners may be exposed to as a result of suspending performance or terminating the voyage charter party. And it also includes an indemnity for any expenses owners may incur. Now, as far as suspension goes, it's quite likely that clause 16 will be deemed to have been incorporated into a contract of carriage if that finds its way into a bill of lading. I would submit it's sufficiently germane, and that by itself might provide owners for a defense against a cargo claim or claim from cargo interest right from the outset. But if not, the indemnity continues to apply against charterers to cover owners for any additional exposure they may face. But of course, it's important to know that indemnities are generally construed narrowly. It's best to, and owners will have to be clear that they are entitled to suspend performance or terminate the charter party under clauses 16a and 16b. So it's very important to be absolutely right that sums are due and have gone unpaid. Now, turning to the next clause on the next slide, that's clause 17, the strikes clause. This is a new strikes clause, but it is similar to the 1994 strikes clause. Although I would say it's a significant reworking. It's quite a fair bit more systematic and distinguishes between different scenarios a bit better, I'd say. I'd also go so far as to say it provides a calibrated, even fair sharing of risks in the event of an intervening strike. Now, what remains the same from 994 and the 2022 clauses is that the strike must, or the lockouts must affect or prevent the actual loading of the cargo. So that arguably limits the scope of what sort of strikes and lockouts might be relevant for clause 17. Um, arguably strikes at a railway line bringing cargo into port, that may not qualify. So now returning to how I was saying that this new strikes clause provides for a very systematic approach to strikes. Clause 17a applies arguably on the approach voyage on any account before commencement of the loading. What clause 17a also provides is that a strike must already exist at any of the load port or any of the loading ports. So it must already be prevailing, and it must likely delay or prevent the actual loading of cargo. So that's the speculative element of the strike. The existence of the strike must already be in fact. What 17a then entitles owners to do is to request that charterers will agree to stick to the agreed laytime provisions and treat the strike or lockout as not affecting the running of laytime. And charterers have 24 hours to respond to owners' notice, and owners and if charterers fail to do that, owners have the option but not the obligation to terminate the charter party. Of course, the more interesting question is what happens if charterers don't affirm the agreed laytime provisions and owners decide to continue the charter party. I suppose the implication is that we would apply clause 17b, but I'll come to that in a moment. Now, remaining with the comparison between the strikes clause in the 1994 terms and the Gencon 2022 terms, the 1994 terms expressly provides for what happens if there are several parcels of cargo and if part cargo has already been loaded. Now, if part cargo is already on board, owners need to complete the agreed carriage of that particular cargo. And if owners don't, if a similar notice is sent to charterers to maintain the laytime provisions, but owners don't agree to stick by them, owners do not need to load the remaining parcels of cargo if the strikes would affect the actual loading of those parcels. Now, under the 1994 terms, owners also have the right to source completion cargoes on their own and load them for their own account. So that's something that the Gencon 2022 terms don't specifically address as to what happens if parcels of cargo have been loaded or are to be loaded and strikes affect some of them, and that would now fall under clause 17b. Now, in clauses 17b, 17c work together, and clause 17d I think replicates that calibrated sharing of risks, if I can be so bold as to quote myself, in the discharging side of operations. So I'll just take you through clauses 17b and 17c. 17d pretty much is about the same thing. When a strike breaks out after loading commences, the sharing of risks provide that for the first 10 days, laytime or demurrage run at 50% from the breakout of the strike. And after the 10th day, laytime and demurrage is restored to the 100% of what was previously agreed. Now, if strikes continue to affect the loading, and this hits 25 days of delay, this is cumulative count of 25 days of delay, owners can now possibly claim a higher rate, mean, owners enjoy the price floor of an agreed demurrage rate. But if the market has moved, if daily hire for the vessel has gone up, or your estimated bunker costs have gone up, owners can require charterers to meet these increased costs. If arguably this could end up helping operators cover themselves for any exposure they may incur for late redelivery under their time charters in. But well, now I think so. Now if I can move on to the general exceptions clause on the next slide, that's this is a new clause. It was not included in the 1994 form, and it's understood that this is the drafting committee's response to the market's own solution to the lack of a mutual exceptions clause in the 1994 standard form. Now, I'm sure we've all seen this, that parties would negotiate in force majeure clauses into their recaps or their fixture notes. Now, specifically negotiated force majeure clause can cover any number of intervening circumstances and provide for a variety of different remedies, whatever your imagination can conjure. But clause 18 perhaps is not the broadest clause, although it is too broad for each circumstance to be individually ventilated here. Uh, and but what's important is that clause 18 does not provide parties with a right to terminate the charter party simply because one of these named events occur. All it does is that it covers parties, or it exempts parties from liability for loss or damage or delay if any of these events occur. The common factor with the general law on force majeure clauses and clause 18 is that clause 18 expressly provides very helpfully that either party that's claiming the benefit of this exceptions clause needs to show that the resulting loss or damage could not reasonably have been avoided or guarded against. This is a qualifying requirement, I'd say, to rely on clause 18 to avoid liability. The other common factor with the law that we traditionally are familiar with is that these clauses do not affect the running of laytime and demurrage. The last sentence of clause 18 makes that abundantly clear. Whatever parties have agreed in terms of interruptions and exceptions to laytime, that's the general exceptions clause is not intended to expand on that. Now, the last clause that I'll be taking you through is clause 26, the agency clause. It's perhaps not the most glamorous, but we get inquiries on this quite often, and the law in this area is generally developed or arguably developed from the 1984 decision in the Sagona. Now, clause 26 is a helpful. It's far more detailed than the previous agency clause in the 1994 form. The previous form merely placed the obligation of appointing agents on owners. The new clause makes it helpfully clear. Oh, sorry, Tom. Could I trouble you to change the next slide? Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. So coming back to this new clause makes it clear that charterers appoint agents. Sorry about that. Charterers nominate agents, and owners appoint and pay the agents. Now, but it also makes clear that agents who take over certain delegated tasks from owners or from charterers separately continue to perform these tasks as agents of the owners or charterers, as the case may be, whoever has delegated the task to them. And the overriding idea is that agents wear different hats, and be it for head owners, time charterers, or operators, and voyage charterers who deal directly with the cargo operations, agents are acting simultaneously and independently as agents for all these parties, without one of the owners or time charterers or voyage charterers becoming liable for the errors of agents when they are performing another task. So agreement, and that's it's a whole separate variety of issues. So that's it for the slides that I'll be taking you through, and I'll hand the time back to Julien to take
Thank you
us through
very
the-
much, Ganesh. Now to finish with, the drafting committee also incorporated many standard clauses in the Gencon 2022, just like they did in the NYP 2015. So, for example, they included the electronic bills of lading clause, the ICE clause, the ISPS clause for voice charter parties, sanctions clause, war risk, piracy and piracy clause, and the law and arbitration clause. What they didn't incorporate is, as Ganesh explained just now, is the force majeure clause. So be careful if you use this clause, you should, and you need a force majeure clause, you should continue to use your old one in your previous standard form that you normally use. Next, so this is the end of the presentation. So to conclude, there are major changes, such as the owner's obligation in clause 2. You'll see that it's a complete rewrite. The strike clause, for example, is completely rewritten. There are new clauses, such as the responsibility as who has to deal with the environmental regulations, and for example, the suspension clause and the suspension and withdrawal clause, which kind of mirrors a time charter party, and in a way puts the disponent owner that is also an owner under a voyage charter party on a more back-to-back footing with the owner under the time charter party. So it's a generally well thought and complete charter party, although there's still no force majeure clause. Thank you very much. If you want to read a little bit more about this, we have an article that came out a week or two ago on our website, which you can you'll be at liberty to read. There aren't any Q&As, so that's it from us. Thank you very much for attending, and good evening from Singapore.